Modern German cities operate on a rhythm of comfortable routine. People walk to work, shop at local bakeries, and wait at crosswalks on ordinary streets. But dropping straight through the pavement and into the dirt reveals a massive blind spot where the familiar sunlight disappears. This cross-section maps the scale of the footprint. A sprawling, interconnected web of subterranean architecture branches out through the soil, extending far beyond a standard cellar. While millions live active lives above ground, thousands of tons of static concrete sit quietly below. These complexes were engineered at enormous expense for specific, urgent reasons. Yet today, an entire society moves across the surface, having largely forgotten the world it built directly beneath its feet. The shift downward began with the military escalation of the Second World War. When the threat of conflict became an immediate reality, national defense had to seek protection deep in the earth. This construction site shows the physical urgency of the era. Soldiers and laborers rapidly deployed massive amounts of raw concrete to survive direct surface strikes. When aerial bombardment targeted the cities, survival meant packing civilian populations into these dense, vaulted subterranean shelters. Survival also extended to the war effort. In massive rock tunnels like this, entire assembly lines for aircraft fuselages were relocated deep underground. That thick rock ceiling was the only physical barrier standing between the nation's wartime industrial capacity and complete destruction. The surface had become unlivable. This initial subterranean layer was a desperate physical reaction to an immediate threat from above. Decades later, the threat shifted to nuclear fallout during the Cold War. While the weapon had changed, the logic remained the same. Safety required digging deeper. This diagram illustrates a major engineering leap. The shelter evolved into a self-sustaining artificial habitat, requiring independent power, water, and air systems. To survive, closed-loop filtration systems scrubbed toxins and cycled breathable air to thousands sealed off from the atmosphere. Today, the remnants of that life support engineering are visible in these rusting ventilation ducts and industrial electrical grids decaying in the dark. For those intended to live here, these would have been alien, claustrophobic environments, cramped spaces built strictly for survival rather than comfort. These systems are the physical result of engineering survival into the very bedrock, a mechanical attempt to preserve life when the surface is expected to be uninhabitable. When the Cold War ended, the imminent threat evaporated. The surface became safe again, and this vast subterranean network immediately lost its primary purpose. Faced with millions of tons of obsolete architecture, city planners often chose erasure. Many bunkers were demolished, filled with dirt, or paved over to reclaim the land. In other cases, sites were preserved as active museums, where heavy blast doors open for tourists, acting as a physical ledger of the past. Then there are the spaces left to abandonment. In the woods, you can still find dark concrete voids, quietly being reclaimed by the forest floor. The decision to destroy, preserve, or ignore these structures highlights how a society struggles to process the physical remnants of its own history. Today, a pedestrian might park their car or walk through a public park without ever knowing what lies just a few feet down. Whether buried under new construction or hiding beneath a quiet hill, the steel and concrete poured during decades of fear remain firmly in place. History isn't limited to the archives. It is a dense, physical foundation, supporting the peaceful surface world we navigate every day. Walking through a modern German city, you might completely miss the brutalist concrete structures hiding right behind sleek glass facades. After the Second World War, a traumatized society wanted to erase these scars. But these monoliths were engineered to be indestructible, making them financially and logistically impossible to demolish. Cities adapted by building around them, sealing them up, or repurposing them entirely. Today, entire modern neighborhoods sit directly on top of historical trauma. Viewing these buildings merely as urban anomalies or lost places ignores their terrifying original purpose. They were desperate monuments to civilian survival. To understand these impossible structures, we have to go back to a time when the front line shifted directly into the sky. This aerial reconnaissance photo reveals bombs detonating across a dense residential grid. Standard homes offered zero protection, forcing the underground to become a mandatory part of daily life. This image reveals the totality of that destruction. With city blocks reduced to roofless shells, survival on the surface became mathematically impossible for the population. The lethal threat from the sky necessitated an entirely new type of urban engineering, brutalist architecture, dedicated strictly to preserving human life against explosive force. This wide shot shows a massive flak tower, one of the many bunker types hastily constructed. While some were highly visible above-ground leviathans, others were smaller, integrated neighborhood shelters. The primary defense was the physical barrier itself. Builders poured incredibly thick, heavily reinforced concrete walls, specifically engineered to absorb and deflect the massive shockwaves of direct hits. This photograph highlights the thick, reinforced steel blast door and heavy latching mechanisms, the critical choke point sealing out the outside world's devastation. This diagram illustrates the internal life support mechanisms. Specialized filtration systems pulled toxic outside air in, scrubbed it, and distributed breathable oxygen. Secondary survival systems, like independent water reservoirs and isolated power grids, ensured basic lighting and hydration even if city infrastructure failed. Engineers had transformed the concept of shelter into a sealed, independent survival machine, one designed to outlast the total destruction of the city surrounding it. Entering the bunker meant embarking on a terrifying physical descent, a psychological transition suspended entirely between the fear of death and the hope for survival. Once inside, civilians faced a stark, claustrophobic reality. As you can see in this arched concrete tunnel, simple, repetitive brick partitions were designed strictly for maximum capacity, stripping away any sense of comfort. The occupants were not soldiers. This image of women and children standing amid the rubble reflects the true demographic of these spaces, families forced into tightly packed, suffocating quarters. They sat in the dim lighting, listening to the earth shake and feeling the heavy concrete ceilings violently vibrate, completely blind to what would be left of their homes once the sirens stopped. Despite their engineering, the actual human experience inside these walls was defined by utter powerlessness and a total loss of personal freedom. When the war ended and the smoke cleared, large parts of these cities were reduced to rubble, yet the concrete stood firm, remaining behind as permanent scars. Today, some of these structures stand openly in residential areas as grim reminders. Others remain entirely sealed off, invisible beneath new streets and modern parks. These structures serve as physical archives, preserving the weight of wartime societal decisions and the trauma of the civilians who once inhabited them. Trapped inside that concrete are deeply personal stories, the hours of families spent huddled together, the agonizing waits for relatives, and even children born amidst the deafening roar of bombs. Because history is made of individual lives, these indestructible structures demand we never forget the terrifying reality of civilian survival. Deep below ground, the silence of this abandoned space is broken only by heavy water that echoes through the cracked concrete. You are looking at the remnants of a highly classified complex engineered for an apocalyptic scenario. To understand why this structure exists, we have to look back to the years following the Second World War. Germany was split, and Europe became the central fault line of the Cold War. There were no open battles between the superpowers. Instead, the threat of annihilation hung over a divided landscape, enforced by physical barriers and constant surveillance. On the surface, both sides maintained high-alert military readiness. Fleets of armor and troops were positioned in constant preparation for a sudden strike. But this created a severe logistical problem. If an instantaneous strike could wipe out communications and leadership in minutes, keeping the command structure above ground was a massive liability. To ensure the survival of the state apparatus, the decision was made to shift critical operations deep underground. It marked the start of an era of obsessive, large-scale subterranean construction. Planners designed massive subterranean cities, spanning multiple levels and miles of corridors, entirely distinct from the simple air raid cellars of the 1940s. They relied on what engineers call a closed-loop survival system. The architecture was deliberately structured so that inhabitants could operate for months, completely isolated from the surface world. To survive severe fallout, the complexes required extreme air quality control. Massive intakes and chemical filtration banks constantly scrubbed the air of radioactive particles and heavy toxins. Lockdown also required zero reliance on outside utility grids. Planners installed massive underground generators for independent power and tapped into subterranean reservoirs to secure long-term water supplies. These spaces were engineered as fully autonomous survival machines. Their primary function was to keep a critical fraction of the government alive while the world above burned. Despite their staggering size, the construction and operation of these facilities were shrouded in extreme secrecy. The public living nearby knew absolutely nothing about what was beneath their feet. Many of these sprawling complexes were hidden in plain sight, dug directly beneath ordinary military barracks, standard government offices, and quiet forested hills. Specialized bunkers were also dedicated to protecting vital intelligence nodes, acting as the secure routes for massive radar and listening stations on the surface. Behind heavy blast doors, localized command centers actively plotted war scenarios on giant maps of Europe, working through the logistics of a global conflict right beneath an oblivious public. This hidden network became a physical manifestation of a nation on edge. It was a shadow infrastructure, fully staffed and waiting for a day that the people inside hoped would never arrive. In 1989 and 1990, the geopolitical landscape fractured. The Berlin Wall fell, and thousands of people gathered directly on top of the barrier that had divided the continent. Decades of dread dissolved almost overnight. The tension that had driven half a century of military planning was quickly replaced by widespread celebration and the peaceful reunification of Germany. This created an immediate logistical reality for the shadow network below. The specific apocalyptic war these bunkers were engineered to survive was officially canceled. A rapid de-escalation followed. Surface barracks were shuttered, high-alert protocols were stood down, and military units started packing their bags to leave. Spaces once defined by buzzing radios, armed guards, and high-stakes tension were locked up and left to the silence of dripping water and peeling paint. These rusting air filters and thick concrete slabs remain as physical records of a time when governments actively planned for a world that might end tomorrow. Walking through these empty halls offers physical proof of a disaster we managed to avoid. They stand as quiet monuments to a time when peace was never guaranteed. Look at a typical German landscape today. You see quiet rivers, expansive parks, and modern industrial hubs operating smoothly alongside residential neighborhoods. But directly beneath these everyday surfaces lies an invisible, forgotten world of massive man-made structures. In historical mining areas like the Ruhr region and the Harz Mountains, the earth is hollowed out. there are sprawling networks of tunnels plunging hundreds of meters deep. Over the decades, these massive complexes have been swallowed by time and creeping nature. Today, many of them survive only as faint dashed lines in local archives or as rumors in regional folklore. The solid ground beneath our feet is actually a porous, layered vault holding generations of hidden industrial history. This underground world began centuries ago through the intense extraction of coal, ore, and other raw materials. For the communities living above, the underground was a normal, heavily populated workplace. Enormous surface structures, like this massive headframe, were built specifically to lower thousands of local workers down into the earth every single day. Down in the dark, hollowing out the earth was brutal, manual labor. Men dug through solid rock face using hand tools, working in cramped spaces held up entirely by thick timber supports. When the Industrial Revolution hit, the demand for these raw materials skyrocketed. To feed the factories on the surface, the tunnels expanded rapidly, pushing deeper and wider into the bedrock. By hollowing out its own foundations to fuel its industrial rise, Germany inadvertently constructed the architectural groundwork for a much darker purpose decades later. During the Second World War, relentless Allied bombing campaigns began systematically destroying the country's surface manufacturing capabilities. Faced with an existential threat to their supply lines, the regime made a desperate strategic pivot. They began relocating crucial production lines deep underground, retrofitting those existing mines and hollowing out natural caves to hide from the sky. The scale of these subterranean factories is staggering. Entire aerospace manufacturing lines were moved into vast, artificially lit rock caverns, large enough to house rows of assembled aircraft fuselages, hundreds of feet below the surface. Highly organized, brick-lined tunnels were converted into workshops, with laborers operating lathes and precision equipment in the same cramped spaces once used for extraction. These facilities frequently relied on forced labor, where thousands worked under lethal conditions. These sites serve as physical witnesses to the darkest chapters of the era. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the surface world tried to move on. These massive underground complexes were quickly sealed up, allowed to flood with groundwater, or left to be overgrown by creeping plants and forest roots. A space originally carved out for resource extraction was weaponized into a fortified shield, only to be buried and abandoned the moment conflict ended. Today, the mystery of what remains down there is alluring, but these structures are actively deteriorating. They are highly volatile time capsules. The physical environment is lethal. The earth shifts, causing sudden cave-ins. Deep, unmapped shafts drop into nothingness. Groundwater floods tight corridors without warning, and toxic, bad air lingers in the unventilated dark. Because of these unseen hazards, these environments are strictly off-limits to the public. It takes authorized historians and structural experts to safely enter and document what survives. What they find proves how completely human history is bound to the physical landscape. A quiet, modern forested hill acts as a living roof over centuries of buried industry, struggle, and survival. While the surface world constantly modernizes and shifts its landscape, the earth below remains a silent, permanent archivist of the history that has vanished from the surface. Walk through almost any German city today, and you'll find smooth streets, modern buildings, and a landscape that feels entirely resolved. The surface we live on suggests a nation at peace with its geography. But immediately beneath that pavement lies a different reality. Just meters below the sidewalk, forgotten tunnels and sealed bunkers rest in absolute darkness. As cities grow and adapt, they naturally build over their older foundations. Industrial sites are repurposed, unsafe tunnels are filled in, and old entryways are bricked up. When those access points disappear, the spaces themselves slip out of our collective memory. We have to ask what happens to our connection to the past when the physical evidence that shaped us is paved over. A history that only exists on paper is vulnerable. When the physical evidence disappears, we lose the ability to stand where the past happened and measure its true scale. The German underground is a fragmented mosaic of history. Each layer of the soil represents a different, turbulent era, overlapping one another in the dark. At the deepest levels, we find the scars of early industrialization. Heavy wooden beams pressed down on narrow mine shafts, built by laborers who spent their waking lives extracting coal and stone in near-total darkness. Moving closer to the surface, the architecture changes to massive concrete defensive structures. These flak towers and reinforced bunkers were engineered during the Second World War to withstand intense aerial bombardment. While the exteriors project military strength, the interiors tell a story of civilian terror. Thousands of ordinary families spent days crowded around cooking pots in these exact rooms, waiting for the sirens to stop. The final historical layer belongs to the Cold War. These modular facilities, sealed behind thick steel blast doors, were built for an age defined by political division and the constant threat of global conflict. Every element in these rooms was organized around worst-case scenarios. Planners tracked the movements of a divided continent from these subterranean offices, reflecting the high-stakes anxiety of the era. These layered structures act as physical vessels. They capture the resilience and the suffering of the people who inhabited them, making those experiences tangible. Knowing this, we have to ask why it is necessary to preserve the memory of these specific physical environments. It is because these structures provide history made spatial. Standing in these rooms transforms abstract facts into a tangible sensory reality. You can read about the tonnage of bombs dropped on a city, but you truly understand the scale of the threat when you can measure exactly how thick a concrete wall had to be to survive it. You can study the industrial production quotas, but a low-angle push through a narrow stone corridor forces your shoulders to feel the claustrophobia of a miner's daily life. And when you step into an abandoned subterranean room today, the absolute heavy silence contrasts sharply with the thousands of desperate people who once packed every available inch. This geometry forces us to occupy the exact physical space of the people who came before us. It makes the past inescapable and deeply resonant. As Europe recovered and cities rebuilt their shattered centers, new roads and commercial buildings naturally covered over the wartime craters and access hatches. From a purely practical standpoint, it is inevitable that many underground entrances will be bricked up and unused facilities will vanish from public view. But sealing a door or paving a road does not mean the history of that space has been erased. The history of these spaces simply changes form. It survives in archives, architectural blueprints, and the recorded testimonies of the people who lived and worked there. That past remains a patient, silent witness beneath our daily routines, whether it's under a modern office building or a quiet forest floor. The stories of those who survived in the dark remain vividly alive as long as we continue to ask what lies hidden beneath our feet. True historical preservation relies on an active, questioning curiosity, a willingness to keep looking at the unseen layers of our civilization.